Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 5, the finale of Undercover Gangsta. Now listen to me, I need to explain something to you. Being a part of a gang, sometimes you have to do things that are not going to make a lot of sense, most especially to people that are not a part of a gang. But when you're head of an organization, particularly a street organization, a criminal organization, you have to do what's best for the organization, and maybe in most cases not yourself. Yes, it'll put you at risk, but it's the organization that you have to be more concerned about before yourself. And that's the position that B-Mac found himself in. He had to think about Two-Face Mafia and what would happen to it and how everything could change at the drop of a dime if he were allowed to continue to do the things that he was doing by bringing heat to the organization, because he was upset with the decisions that he had made and how he had gotten tricked by the warden in trying and thinking that if he does him a favor, he was going to help him get out of prison. It's a mistake that most people make all the time in the penitentiary. Quid pro quo. But in this situation, in the penitentiary, quid pro quo is not quid pro quo. You don't get an equal portion for whatever it is that you're going to do. The advantage is always going to be with the administration. And that's just that. That's just that. They didn't see J-Mac as anything other than the slave that he was. And they used and manipulated him when he had the position and power of the organization and the credibility and the reputation, the stellar reputation within the Two-Face Mafia. They used that to their advantage. And he destroyed himself in the process. All because he wanted to go home. That need, that desire to be validated by anybody, everybody, when you're in prison, it becomes overwhelming, and you have people within the system that know how to pull on that thread and manipulate that. And J-Mac was ripe for the picking. So B-Mac had to make a decision, that he did. And in the process of making that decision, he made sure that the security detail would tie up loose ends without even knowing that they were tying up the loose ends. And he put on the show and he punished them, but in a year, he was going to make it all right with them. And they were going to be elevated and didn't even understand and won't even understand why they were being elevated to the position that they were going to be in, because they held it down and they did exactly what he wanted them to do without them even knowing that that's what he needed them to do. And that's how the thing, when you're part of an organization, that's what usually happens. There's a lot of things that happen that you don't even realize that are happening. But here's the situation. B-Mac gets a phone call from the warden. Now, B-Mac is confused because he's saying, how did the warden get this number? So he started to think real fast, because he's smart on his feet, and he thought that this phone had to be the phone that he was talking about. J-Mac was communicating with the warden on, because the warden called this number just like that. And when B-Mac answered it, he said, hello. And he said, this is the warden. And when he said that, B-Mac said, what can I do for you? And he said, well, it looks like you already have. He said, we're making the family notification as we speak. Is there anything that you would like me to say to his sister on your behalf? And B-Mac knew what he was doing. He knew that the warden was sticking it to him. He knew that. Because the warden also knew that B-Mac didn't do that for him. He did it for himself. But the warden wanted to stick it to him, put the pressure on him, make him feel like that he had done him a favor. And he told him, he said, I owe you. Whether you want to accept it or not is up to you, but I owe you. You solved a lot of problems for me and some friends of mine by taking out J-Mac. And nothing will ever come of it. When we ship his body home to his sister, nobody will say a word about it. And nobody will even know but me and you. And the warden was laughing. So B-Mac, he took offense to that. He said, is there anything else? And he said, no. He said, do you? He said, I'm going to let you loose a little bit. B-Mac hung up the phone and he sat there and he was thinking. He said, man, I've created a problem for myself now. But see, here's the situation. When you're in prison, there's only so much that you can do. There's only so much you can do. B-Mac was in a position that most people would never even experience. Being the head of an organization, but being limited by the fence, being limited by what you could and couldn't do. Was it all worth it? Was becoming head of the two-faced mafia worth it? Somebody that he had looked up to, he had to make a decision, and he did. He watched that same individual make that same decision about the supreme leader before him, what it took place after him, after he was hired. So he couldn't help but think, is this what my future holds for me? Is this what it all comes down to? You make it to the top only to get taken out? Is this what the future of being the head of an organization calls for? And he couldn't help but conclude, but yes, that's what it calls for. So he found himself wondering what he was going to do next. How was he going to protect himself? And the paranoia started to weigh on him. Think about it, y'all. You're head of the two-faced mafia. You're head of an organization. You see the two previous individuals that were head of the organization, they're gone. They're not by the opposition's hand, not by the police hand, but by your hand, the organization's hand. All you're doing is slaughtering each other. And his mind started to play tricks on him. He sat in the cell and he could hear J-Mac's voice in his ear, and he could hear the Tasmanian Devil's voice in his ear, and all he was saying to himself is, I can't go out like that. I can't go out like that. So he had many sleepless nights trying to figure out how to avoid becoming a statistic of the two-faced mafia. He couldn't trust anybody. He made his circle smaller and smaller. He even became paranoid of the individuals that put in the work, that took care of the business, of the two peons that took care of J-Mac. He became paranoid of them, thinking that they might figure out what happened. What if they tell somebody that I told them to stand back? What if they do this? What if they do that? And he found himself plotting against them. He couldn't take the confusion that was running through his mind. He couldn't take all of the drama that was playing out in his name. And he screamed every night, I don't want this. I don't want this. See, that's what happens. That's what happens. See, it's not like being the head of a company where you can build a legacy and pass it on and help people in the community. Being head of a criminal organization means that you survive as long as you survive. And part of surviving as a head of a criminal organization is you eat, they eat. If they don't eat, you get eaten. That's that. If they have a problem with what's going on with you, they replace you. Think about it. J-Mac was able to retire and walk away, only to be manipulated and used and brought back. And then he retired again and walked away, only to be taken out by the manipulation of the two-faced mafia, directed by B-Mac. Now what do? What do you do now? So he started to plot. Started to plot to figure out how he was going to make his next move, his best move. He knew that the warden was going to be a problem because eventually the warden was going to come and ask for a favor, and he had to make a decision. And that day came real fast. The warden had a problem in the prisons. It was this new drug that was surfacing in the prison, and it was causing the individuals in the prison to spaz out. It was causing them to have seizures. And they didn't have a way to detect it. So when they were taking all of these guys to the clinic, they were asking them what was wrong, what did they do? And they were almost like comatose, and they couldn't talk, and they couldn't explain what was going on to them. They were throwing up, and they were relieving them, their bowels was running, they were doing all kinds of things, and they just couldn't talk and respond to the questions that the nurses or the administration was asking them. And then the next day they would all be okay and had no memory of what was going on. So the warden, he activated every informant that he had on the compound. What is going on? What is this new drug that's permeating throughout this prison? And they had no answer for him. They had no answer for him. And then the phone calls started coming in from the commissioner. This new drug was spreading across the system. They were getting daily reports of inmates falling out, inmates spazzing out, inmates having seizures, inmates being comatose and then waking up later on or coming to their senses and having no memory of what they had just done. Nurses were being assaulted. Officers were being assaulted. They were having superhuman strength. But nobody knew what was going on. They were giving them urinalysis, piss tests, and nothing was coming up. It was negative. They were giving them blood tests, but they didn't know what they were looking for. It was negative. They couldn't keep them in the hole. They had to take them back out and put them back on the compound because they had no mechanism within the system that they had set up to deal with what was going on. So they had to treat it as a medical issue and put them back on the compound. And then, over time, the word started getting around. They called it ghost. Ghost smoke. That was the name of it. Now, when the warden talked about it in the meetings, he knew that this was just something that they called it. But he wanted to know specifically what was it and how were they using it? What was the delivery system? And when I say delivery system, what I mean is how they're getting it in their bodies. You know what I'm saying? The delivery system, like if you're smoking crack, your delivery system is the pipe. You feel me? If you're smoking weed, you use a bong, or you can just smoke it through paper. You feel what I'm saying? If you're using drugs through a needle, the delivery system is the needle. You understand? So what was the delivery system? How were they using this ghost smoke? How were they getting it inside of their bodies? So they caught one of the informants that's on the compound, and they said, we need you to find out what's going on. Now, everybody knew that this guy was an informant. Everybody knew. But see, one of the things about being an informant in here, as long as you're contributing to the economy, somebody's going to take a chance on you. Even if it's against their better judgment, because they want that money, they want that moolah. So he put himself out there, he's looking for it. So he was approached. He was approached by one of the dealers. So I hear you looking for that ghost smoke. And he's like, yeah. He said, how much does it cost? He said, you give me $50 and I'm going to give you this. And he held out a piece of paper. It was about the size of a stamp. And the informant said, what is this? How do I use it? He said, don't you know? And he told him, he said, no. He said, look, let me show you something. So he took 2 batteries. And he took a razor and broke the razor, got the piece of the razor out, the part that you use to shave. And he put it on top of the battery. And he put the piece of paper right there. And it burnt it. And it burnt it all up. It was just a very, very small piece of paper, about the size, twice the size of an ink pen head. And when the smoke came up, he said, inhale that. And the informant inhaled it. And he was gone. Just that quick. He was higher than he had ever been in his life. And he stood there, frozen in time, with a smile on his face, not moving. And the dealer looked at him, and while the dealer was staring at him, a tear rolled down his cheek. And the dealer just kept staring at him, and he started smiling because he knew he had a new customer. Whether he was the police or not, he knew he had a new customer. So after about 10 or 15 minutes, the informant miraculously just automatically just come back. And he looked at the dealer and he said, where's the rest of it? And he handed him the piece of paper that was the size of a stamp that was minus the piece that he had smoked. And the informant walked away and went straight to his room and proceeded to get high. He was summoned later by the shift commander, the captain. He said, "You got any information for us?" And he looked at the captain, eyes glossed over, high as a kite, shook his head left to right. Without even saying a word, he just shook his head. The captain looked at him, and he leaned back in the chair. And he knew that his informant was on the drugs now. So they stood him up. And they went through his pockets and they found the batteries and they found the little piece of the razor and they found the paper. They didn't know what that was, so they discarded that and threw it in the trash. So this is how they must be getting it in their system. He said, "Where are the drugs at?" And the informant, high, he just pointed to the trash, couldn't say a word. So the captain looked back up at him, and when the captain looked back up at him, he looked down at the trash, he saw the piece of paper, he grabbed the piece of paper, he said, "This is it?" The informant shook his head up and down without saying a word, indicating yes. So the captain set the paper down on the desk and he looked at it. And he said, "It's just a piece of paper." And the informant just sat there and he smiled. He's comatose. So the captain picked up the piece of paper and he smelled it, put it up to his nose. He couldn't get a smell from it. He stuck out his tongue and put it on the paper and he couldn't get a taste from it. He said, "What is it? Do you know what it is?" And the informant shook his head left to right, indicating no, he didn't know. All he knew is that this is what got him high, higher than he had ever been in his life. Higher than he had ever been in his life. And he sat there and he smiled. And for the next 15 or 20 minutes, the captain just sat there staring at him, wondering what was going on. Why was he like this? What was this new drug? And if you want to find out what the captain found out and what turned up when they tested that, you're going to have to tune in to season 3 of Undercover Gangsta. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I said peace, y'all.